Everyone, and particular thanks to Carla this morning for inviting me to participate in her class on strategic leadership. Um, it's always a pleasure to work with young people in particular on subjects. And by way of brief introduction, my name is Linda Langston. I was an elected official in Linn County for 14 years, and after that, I went to work for the National Association of Counties as their Director of Strategic Development and Relations. And now I am back in Iowa doing a multitude of things, serving on boards, advising some political campaigns, and generally having fun. So here you are finishing up your master's degrees in not-for-profit leadership. And Carla has asked me to talk about my perspective, particularly in disasters, as relates to leadership and interface with different organizations. So those of you in Iowa City may remember the floods of 2008, when both Iowa City and Cedar Rapids and both Johnson and Linn County had very, very significant flooding. Cedar Rapids had about 10 square miles underwater, and Johnson County was very much impacted as well. And by circumstance, I ended up being chair of the Board of Supervisors in the county, and so I spent an enormous amount of time out at the Emergency Operations Center. But before I go much further, I want to share a couple of books. These are just books that I found useful over the course of my career. I've given a list to Carla, but I'm going to highlight one called Leadership on the Line by Ron Heifetz and Marty Linsky. I've done a couple of courses with Marty, one a county leadership class back in 2004, and then he was one of the professor leads in a class that I did at the Kennedy School of Government. And it's a very easy read, and I think gives you some perspective on some of the things that you need to keep in mind about your own style of leadership. So a couple of things that I'm going to share from that book really have to do with understanding the situations you're in, and that sometimes you or the situation can be your best opportunity or your biggest challenge. Marty and Ron talk about one thing, that sometimes when you're in the middle of particularly messy and harried situations, they think of it like being on a dance floor, where it's really hard to see all the people who are on the dance floor, really how your partner is in relationship to all the other people in the room, what kind of space you have to move in. And they recommend that it's important at sometimes to get on the balcony. If you think about those old gyms that many of you may have gone to high school in, there's oftentimes the lower level, and then there's the balcony that might be a part of the gym. And so the recommendation is to get up higher so you have a perspective on what's going on the dance floor. Once you're up there, you need to see that perspective, but then you also need to make the decision to go back down on the dance floor. There are a couple of other things in Marty's book that I think are pretty significant. One of the chapters is called Thinking Politically. So you do have to understand that you don't operate in a vacuum, and you have to interface with a wide variety of people. And how do you understand those folks and help them to get to solutions with you? There's also thinking about how you orchestrate conflict. And this, I think, is a big one that I think I found that I didn't really understand when I was younger, and that I have a much better understanding of now, partially thanks to the courses that I did in leadership. So this is really about what's going on in the room. What are the people doing? And there are times when you may need to what is called turning up the heat. So it may be that things are quiet and complacent enough that really no tension happens and not much gets done. And that can be just as much a challenge as when things are too highly charged. So you need to learn then how to move the system a little bit, how you might inspire a little bit of tension, a little bit of anxiety, and perhaps even a little bit of conflict in order to get something to occur. I learned that I myself have some facility for this, and sometimes in certain situations have known to be a fomenter. And would share with you that at the Harvard Kennedy School, I was actually asked to refrain from making any interventions or taking any lead because of that, and just to step back and watch, which for me is sometimes difficult. So learning how you can turn up the heat to get things to happen. And then on the opposite side, you have to think about what do you do sometimes to keep or to lessen the tension in a room, to avoid the conflict from being all consuming. And a good example, I personally think, is the way the news cycles go today. And everything is so highly charged, and it's a big problem, and it's the end of the world. And people in general cannot live in that space all the time. We know that people have the capacity to change about 5%, which is a very small amount, and they don't actively go to make those changes. So they don't want to know that everything is always awful all the time. So in some situations, you need to learn how to turn down the heat. And a couple of you have brought up some questions in the chat. So you can see that happen. Sometimes people are very good at using humor. And so when the tension starts to rise, you'll note that people will perhaps insert a joke or a distraction. And for some people, it can be very uncomfortable in a situation to have those tensions rise and to live with that tension. So you definitely need to understand, where do you sit on the spectrum, and how do you engage with people, and particularly in groups, so that sometimes it's appropriate to push a little tension, and sometimes it's a little more appropriate to calm things down. Another thing that is really useful is it is not up to you to do the work all on your own. So sometimes you have to give the work back. You have to share it. This is, I think, particularly important in disasters, and I'll talk about a few situations that were within my personal realm of experience. But there is, I think, a particular need after disasters or crises of any kind to get, A, people to engage, and secondly, to get them to talk about what their aspirations are and what they feel needs to be done. It's not just what you think needs to be done, but really helping the community engage as a whole to get things done. And I think there are examples of this, particularly here in Iowa, of people who have had really high proficiency at this. And I would suggest that there was a coach in Appleton, Parkersburg, after the tornadoes that occurred up there, and they were quite devastating, took out the school, took out really a lot of the town. And the coach was really the leader. It wasn't really the elected officials, the mayor. It was the coach at the high school. He was the football coach. And he really set some goals based on some of the people he was talking to. Football is a really big thing in Appleton, Parkersburg. They've sent a fair number of people off to the NFL for such a small town in Iowa. And his goal was to have the school back up and running and football practices taking place. The tornado happened in June, and he was able to attain that, so they were playing football games by September. Now, it was with portable classrooms, and there was not as much infrastructure, but he really led the community forward, setting them a goal, and it was based on many of the people that he talked to and what they felt would be important to bring some normalcy back to their lives. And sometimes I would share with you another book that I have found to be really useful called Boundary Spanning Leadership. And this is a leadership book that talks about, again, how do you build collaborations that allow people to move forward. This was something I learned while attending the Center for Creative Leadership and their work with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And we took a team to focus on leadership, and particularly as it related to the program. And for us, that was a Blue Zones program, and we were looking at food access. We went with a team of 5, and we were part of about 6 other groups of 5 members each when we did this program, and each had different goals that we wanted to attain. But a lot of the work we did in the first couple of days of the program was really understanding where our community was and what was going on. And while we knew that food access was a big issue, I think we learned very quickly that there were some significant issues related to equity and also to transportation and housing needs. That all of these things fit together, and for the community to work successfully and recognize our food access needs, we were also going to have to deal with some of these other issues as well. And in order to do that, and I've seen this happen multiple times in groups that I've been a part of, you have to have an incredible amount of patience. And I would tell you that I am not an inherently patient person. I believe that things should move forward and be on a path, and we should take action. And I've learned that sometimes you need to sit back and let the community or the group of which you are a part of really get together and lead the work themselves. And part of this occurs by first people understanding what are the roles and responsibilities. And I would tell you that in disasters, this is particularly in a larger community setting can be very difficult. Very often, emergency managers and the fire department and the police department have a very robust understanding of what their responsibilities are. Sadly, that does not always encompass the elected officials who may be a part of the group. And I have counseled many elected officials that it is not their role to be out there in the middle of response, that they need to actually be back in the Emergency Operations Center or interfacing with other governmental officials to make sure that resources get to the community. But there's no need for an elected official to be in a boat, to be in a bulldozer. It seems wonderful because it allows you to be seen and take action, but that is not really your role. So first and foremost, you have to help people understand what are their roles and responsibilities. What will be expected of them? Oftentimes, like what timeline will they have to accomplish various tasks? And then mediating what action people will take and what the expectations are that allow people to take action and work together. Also critical within this realm is understanding what is really the ability to listen to others. So I've said that before, and I'll say it again. That and that brings me to another person that I have found very useful, and Patrick Lencioni. In this case, his book is called The Five Dysfunctions of Team. And so here he talks about being accountable and asking you to make sure that your team is accountable, that you meet deadlines, that you do what you say you're going to do. These are all things that are important in the realm, particularly, as I said, leadership as it relates to disasters. One of the challenges that we faced in the disaster in Cedar Rapids and Linn County was really not being able to see what was coming. We knew some from USGS and from NOAA. I still keep the last numbers that I had access to that said the water was going to go to 24 feet above flood. So for some context, in Cedar Rapids, the Cedar River, once it reaches 12 feet, it's at flood stage. Once it would generally reach 19 to 21 feet, we're talking very, very serious floods that will back up in the sewer system and overtop the banks of the river and begin to cause significant damage and perhaps prompt evacuations. So that last piece of information I had was that the flood crest was going to be 24. And those flood standards are determined by the gauges that are on the river that measure where things are going. But at some point, all those gauges got blown out by the river. The river was moving quite fast. So in previous floods, we had seen anywhere from 75 to 95 cubic feet per second, which is really pretty fast. But in this flood situation, we reached about 145 cubic feet per second. And so when you got into the streets after the flood had gone down, you saw that there was an enormous amount of pavement that was ripped out. You saw buildings that had been impacted, vehicles that had been moved. So this is a very serious flood. So without that information, one of the tools that I chose to use was to ask our GIS department, who was in the Emergency Operations Center with me. They had a quiet moment, and I asked them to build me some flood maps where they would show me what would happen if water went to 30 feet flood stage or 35 feet flood stage. They were a little surprised, but I asked them to do this. And we were very lucky. The Emergency Operations Center was out on the campus of Kirkwood College, and the college happened to have an old big map plotter. So they were able to build those maps and give them to me, and they were very, very large. Once they were printed and I took a look at them in the back room, I knew that we had some very fast decisions that we needed to make. One of which was first to bring the police and fire in to examine these maps with us. And the fire department, along with the police department, were doing evacuations of people, and they were doing them in a very thoughtful way, taking a block-by-block approach, which seemingly, under the circumstances, was a good idea, not necessarily moving to go for a wholesale evacuation. But the problem was, if you think about Cedar Rapids, elevations are not always what they seem, and this can be true in many places. And so what we saw was that the water was going to move in places that was actually further away from the river, but because of the basic different elevations and the way the sewer systems were going to move, we were able to tell that water was going to go to some fairly unusual places. I would tell you that those of you, and I know there are a couple of you in the class that are familiar with Cedar Rapids, there is a a small hot dog place that's very close to the county building that's called the Flying Weenie, and it has a big airplane up on top. Now, it looks like it's at the same level as Ingredient and the county buildings, but in fact, it is not. It is just enough high elevation, even though it's only a block away from the river, that it did not flood at all. Whereas Ingredient and the county building, and actually 8 blocks away from the river, flooded. The Flying Weenie stayed dry. So we could begin to see this on the GIS maps. And so that began to change the strategies of both the fire department and the police department. I think it was one of the things that led to the fact that we did not suffer any deaths in this disaster, which is really quite astonishing. And I would then share with you a couple of other circumstances that sometimes you have to learn how to leverage your authority and leadership, because you are not in control of everything. And this is going to happen in many of the not-for-profits that you go to work for. How do you interface with businesses? How do you work with other people? So I was at a press conference and the governor was there. We had learned earlier that day that the Solid Waste Agency in Lynn County was having an enormous amount of trouble getting approvals from the DNR to allow us to reopen the closed landfill, which had settled and had more airspace that could be used for disaster debris. But the DNR was pretty much refusing that, and so we were looking at having to take our debris, in some cases to Marion, but in other cases to Illinois. And that was going to be a very expensive bill for both the community and for FEMA. So the governor was there, and at the end of the governor, he said, Linda, if you ever need anything from me, you just need to ask. And I said, well, funny you should bring that up. I said, I could really use some help building some conversations with DNR and our Solid Waste Agency for debris removal, which was huge because of how many people got flooded out of their homes. And within less than a week, we were able to negotiate a solution. It was something that even though I was on the leadership of the Solid Waste Agency, I was not able to manage on my own. But with the assistance of the governor's office, we were able to get to a solution. So sometimes you have to see when you need help. And sometimes you need to sit back. There were so many people who were struggling with how would they respond to the floods, and why could they not get back to their homes sooner. And I had many lawyers who wanted to get into their offices downtown, and I had to explain to them that it was not possible because we had gas lines that had the potential of blowing up. So even though they had left work product on their desk that they were worried about, it was far better to leave it there rather than be there when potentially the downtown might blow up. So there are situations that you also have to interface with people. We did an enormous number of things that really brought not-for-profits and businesses together to have the kinds of discussions that allowed for really effective recovery. I think we also saw that over time, we had the sense that we were, for the most part, going in the right direction. But it is also important to understand human behavior and what happens to people. So we all had to, and I was oftentimes the person who was bugging particularly other elected officials, but people in general in leadership positions, that you had to know your limits. And sometimes you just need a break. This is very challenging and difficult work. And so sometimes you needed to step away. Sometimes you needed to take a rest. People are very, very focused in the post-disaster world of working as hard as they can, as fast as they can, getting things done, being responsible. But at some point, you also have to understand that recovery, when you move to that recovery phrase, it is very long work, and you cannot exhaust yourself totally at the beginning. So you have to pace yourself, and that is not an easy thing to do. I want to take our last little bit of time to also talk about where do you find leadership. I've been invited to talk both at EMI, the Emergency Management Institute, and at the War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, talking to people who are going through leadership programs, particularly learning about how to handle disasters and how do you interface between local, state, and federal government. So talking back to the area of responsibilities, the reality is that many people on the ground don't understand that you have to have that partnership. Particularly, it's good to have it at any time, but it is enormously helpful to have it in a disaster. That you want to know that FEMA is the lead. The state is who interfaces with FEMA, and the state interfaces with locals, but this partnership has to work. So people have to understand their roles and responsibilities. At the same time, in the process of recovery, oftentimes leaders are not necessarily those who are in elected office. So I mentioned the coach in Applington, Parkersburg, but in every community, there are leaders who step up and really make a difference. And I have gotten to know a woman, Jane Cage, down in Joplin, Missouri, and she was a citizen and a small business owner. And yet she did an enormous amount of work to lead the disaster recovery process in Joplin and make it a better effort. And so I encourage a lot of the folks, particularly who are involved in the military, to learn to look around the room in the Emergency Operations Center and listen for those people who might be leaders. You might find leaders who are at not-for-profits. It might be someone at the United Way. It might be someone in your faith community who can take a leadership role. So it is important to know that sometimes leaders have the title of leader and sometimes people don't. But by their actions and the authority that they exercise in larger settings, they are able to do enormous good work. And I think those people also are part of the element that help us invite others to the table to participate and know that they are going to be a part of the solution. So I'm happy to answer some questions as I wrap up my time. I'll take a look in the chat to see what is most on your mind at the moment. I see that there's a question from Kelsey who's asking about her own leadership style and that she had not thought about this before and that she is oftentimes uncomfortable with tension in the room. And I would offer that, first off, it's a good thing to know about yourself and know that if you understand that about yourself, you don't have to work so hard to lessen the tension. If you can learn to manage that in yourself, you can really begin to look around the room and watch other people. Try to understand that you may feel some anxiety, but you don't have to act on that. And so you can sit with that. You can find a place to doodle on a piece of paper to help you manage those emotions that are going on. And sometimes you can do that in places that are less risky to learn about yourself. And so I find that oftentimes if you're in a less high value situation where you're a part of things, but not necessarily going to be the active leader of a group, you can watch. Watching can give you great insight in understanding what is going on with the group. So as we come to the end of our class today, I want to thank Carla again for inviting me in. I've taken the time to put my contact information in the chat so you can reach back to me and you can ask some questions. Again, thank you very much. It is a delight to spend time with you, and I encourage you all in your careers in the not-for-profit leadership arena. Thanks so much.